How did Plains Indians survive on the Great Plains? Welcome to some revision. Okay, well, you're most likely to be asked about these things: who they actually were, their everyday life, their beliefs, their hunting practices, and the difficulties that they overcame. First of all, we're going to think about who they were. Most likely you'd be asked to briefly describe things about their everyday life and who they were, or perhaps you might be asked to use a source and describe either how useful the source is for telling you about who they were, so what does it tell you, what does it miss out, or perhaps what can you infer from the source, which means what can you work out about who they were. So you would need to pick out something you can see in the source and explain what it tells you about their life or their beliefs. Okay, so who were they then? There were many different Indian nations. There weren't one nation, there wasn't a single group with a single culture, there were different tribes. For example, the Comanche, the Cheyenne, the Sioux, Blackfoot, Zachary, Osage, Iowa, Santee. There were so many different groups. What a majority of them did have in common, though, was that they were nomadic, which means they moved around. They didn't stay in one place. They lived in teepees, which were easy to pack up, and they needed to move around because they needed access to food. It was hard to farm on the plains, and by having teepees and a nomadic life where they moved around, this meant that they could move to where it would be easier for them to hunt things like buffalo for food. The teepees that they had only took about 10 minutes to pack up. They were made of buffalo skin and a limited amount of wood. There wasn't much wood on the plains, so it made sense for there to be something that they could pack up and take with them. They believed things like land couldn't be owned, that it was something that they all shared instead. They didn't believe in ownership of land. They believed that horses were a symbol of power, so horses were brought over in the 16th century to America by the Europeans, particularly the Spanish, and the Native Americans took advantage of this. They used them for hunting. It was easier to transport their goods when they managed to kill a buffalo. It was easier for them to take it back with them. They didn't have to carry it. It could go on the horseback. And it was also easier to transport their teepees and to move around more quickly when they wanted to move and to follow buffalo. And therefore they were symbols of power and something that they would go to war with other tribes for to gain more horses. Tribal boundaries changed, they weren't set in stone, there'd be conflicts between them. The tribes were just as much enemies as with each other as they were with the white European settlers when they arrived, so do bear that in mind when you're answering questions. The head of the tribe was called a chief, and he was in charge of his nation, which would be made up of 7 groups, and each of those groups was broken down into 6 further kind of mini groups. The chief's job was to decide when the tribe needed to move on and to settle any disputes. So what were the roles of different people in everyday life? Well, men, their main role was as hunters for the buffalo. They also looked after the horses, which of course had a lot of symbol of power and prestige for their band, and they protected their band or their nation if they were attacked or if they went to war. Women, their main roles were to look after the teepee, which was their shelter, their home, to prepare and butcher meat and food, to have children and to look after them and help bring them up. Boys, well, their main role was to learn to hunt, so they would be taught sort of hunting games, and they learnt through play as much as also through observing the men. Girls were taught to look after the home, so again they were taught how the teepee should be looked after, how to prepare food, and in games would learn about children and looking after them. And the elderly, they were looked up to as they could give excellent advice. They also helped to raise children. But the Native Indians practiced something called exposure, which was when someone became too old or weak, then they were left behind, basically to die in the wilderness, in the Great Plains, because they believed the survival of the whole band, the group of people, the nation, was more important than any individual. And because it was so important for them to be able to move around and be nomads, to access food, if an elderly person wasn't able to keep up with the pace and with this nomadic life, then they would leave them behind. So, what were the beliefs of the Native Indians? Well, different nations had different beliefs. All Native Indians had in common the idea that everything had a spirit, and that people were a part of nature and not masters over it, and everything within nature had spirits. But some groups, for example the Sioux, believed that there was a great spirit called Wakantanka, and that influenced everything that happened in their lives. They believed that spirits could influence their lives in different ways. So, for example, they practiced rituals like the sun dance, which was aimed to get guidance from the spirits. It was performed by men. They were hung from their pectoral muscles, the muscles on their chests. They'd put things through their chests, and then they'd literally sort of suspend a person in the air from these muscles. The aim was that it would be really painful, because they believed that pain helped them have visions of the spirit world, and that visions helped them to contact the spirit world. So that was the aim of the sun dance, to get guidance. Men in particular were used to these sorts of rituals because they believed that the visions could influence their lives and their decision making, for example, about war and about hunting, which was part of their role. They also practiced a dance called the buffalo dance. The aim of this was to call the buffalo to them. This didn't involve pain, it involved wearing the skin of buffaloes and dancing in a way which was sort of similar to the way that the buffaloes moved. And again, it was aimed to contact the spirit world and to help call the buffalo to them this way. It wasn't just men who were involved in religion. Women were seen as particularly important because they could easily contact the spirit world after puberty because of menstruation, having periods. So that gave them quite a lot of status as well. They didn't necessarily have to be in pain in order to contact the spirit world. Another important nature of their beliefs was that they thought circles were very important. For example, they thought that everything worked in a circle in nature, so you could see the moon, the sun, that sort of thing all worked in circles. And they also believed that people lived in circles, for example, from birth to childhood, adulthood, old age, and then death. And it would start again with birth, so living in a circle. So their villages were arranged in circles, and their teepees were circles to honour the fact that life was like a circle. They also believed that land couldn't be owned, and that particularly high land, really tall land, so hills and mountains, were particularly close to the spirit world and therefore were sacred. So areas like the Black Hills were very sacred to them. They also thought this is where their nations began. So how did the Native Indians or the Plains Indians overcome difficulties they faced? Well, they faced problems with food, shelter, weather, and also actually with danger from other tribes. One thing that they did do was they used buffalo to overcome the problem of a lack of food on the plains, and it was difficult to farm. The buffalo could be hunted, and they used the entire buffalo, so they used it for meat. They could use the skin and the sinews for clothing. They created weapons out of its bones, and they used buffalo chips as well, the dung of the buffalo dried out, to create fire as kind of a fuel, because there wasn't much wood on the plains, so they managed to overcome that problem as well. The problem of shelter, it was difficult to build houses like the Europeans had, because there wasn't enough wood to build wooden houses and shelters, and they moved around a lot as well. So they built teepees, which was a sort of a tent made out of buffalo skin, and this could be put up and down in about 10 minutes, so it was quick to pack away, which fitted with their nomadic lifestyle, and it could easily be made into a travois, which is the name of a sort of sledge, so they could roll all the stuff of the teepee inside of itself and kind of pull it along like a sledge, so it was easy to move around as well, or be pulled along by the horses. The problems of weather, so they had things like blizzards and droughts. During winter, the blizzards of snow falling down could be obviously very cold, but they used teepees to help overcome this problem. They banked them with earth, which means they pushed earth up against its sides to keep it much warmer. In the summer, when it was really hot, if there was a drought, so not much water, they could use their teepees, they could move along to a new area, be nomads. Or if it was particularly warm, then they could raise the sides of the teepee to air it, to keep it cool inside. In overcoming dangers from other tribes, their warfare wasn't particularly high impact. It wasn't designed to kill an enemy. They used things like the counting coup, which was where they would ride up to an enemy and touch him with a special stick, and get away, and the number of times they could do that, the more they could touch the enemy with a stick, the more prestige that they got, the more importance they seemed to have. It made them look more powerful. The main aim when they attacked other tribes was to raid them, to try and steal animals and captives, and it was a usual part of life for the tribes. It wasn't really aimed to kill. If they did attack an enemy, then they would do something called scalping, which is where they took the skin off the skull of a person, because they believed you need the scalp, the skin on the skull, in order to go to their afterlife, which was called the Great Hunting Ground. So by removing the scalp of a person, by scalping them, you wouldn't be attacked by your enemy in the afterlife, in the happy hunting ground. So the buffalo hunt was essential to the survival of the Plains Indians. You're most likely to be asked to either briefly describe it, or how useful a source is for telling you about it, or what can you infer about the hunt from looking at the source. So here are some different aspects you could talk about. It would start with a buffalo dance, the religious ritual, the idea that you needed to contact the spirit world and it would help call the buffalo to them. Then after doing this, they would then either go dressed in wolf skins, and they would creep up close to the buffalo on all fours and then use spears to kill the buffalo, because wearing the wolf skin, the buffalo wouldn't be scared away. Or another method they used was bows and arrows. They'd ride on horseback towards the buffalo. They could be at a safer distance away, less likely to get stampeded by them. And they could kill the buffalo by shooting arrows at it. Maybe it would take about 15 to 20 arrows to kill a buffalo. Or another method they could use, again using horses, which is why they were so important to them, was to stampede the buffalo over a cliff. So to get lots of horses, ride at the buffalo and get them spooked and to scare away, and they all run in a huge group in the direction of a cliff. The buffalo would fall over the cliff and die, and they could be collected and taken back to the nation or the tribe or the group, and be taken for food. So there's different methods that could be used. The buffalo hunt was deemed to be so important that it was rare for Indians to fight to the death with men, because the men were so valuable for hunting, which is why they used the counting coup. The idea of touching the enemy without killing him, it was an idea of bravery, and it showed that he was skillful enough to get close to his enemy, but he didn't value his enemy enough to kill him. So the hunt was an incredibly important aspect of their lives. Okay, here are 3 exam-style questions that you could have go at based on our revision. Briefly describe the religious beliefs of the Plains Indians for 5 marks. Pause this if you want to have a go, and then the answers will appear. Okay, so you could have mentioned any of the following. You could have talked about, obviously you want 5 of these, or 2 explained points. So you could talk about the importance of circles. For 1 point, you could explain the importance of circles and talk about the fact that it affects all their lives. They live in a circle, the sun, the moon. They built their houses in circles, anything like that, for 2 marks. You could talk about Wakantanka being the great spirit god. For another point, you could talk about the happy hunting ground being their afterlife that they reckon that they all were going to go to. That if they use the practice of scalping, it would prevent their enemies from going to the afterlife, as you needed your scalp to access it. That you could have mentioned that pain helped them to have visions and therefore contact the spirit world. That visions were important in order to be able to make decisions about war, to call the buffalo to them for hunting. They believed that things like the sun dance were good for contacting the spirit world for advice. You could talk about the fact that women had special significance, as they were able to contact the spirit world after puberty, whereas men would have to have a special kind of visit to the hunting lodge and have visions and use pain to contact the spirit world. So any 5 of these, or any 2 fully explained aspects of their religious beliefs, would get you the 5 marks. Okay, let's have a go at a 7-mark question. This is an explained question, so you need 2 explained reasons, at least, if not 3. Explain how the Indians survived on the Great Plains. Pause the video if you want to have a go. Okay, so you could have had any 2 or 3 of the following to get yourself the 7 marks. You could have talked about how they were nomadic and hunted buffalo, and that this overcame the problem of farming in extreme weather, so droughts and blizzards made it hard to farm. So being nomads and hunting overcame this problem because they were able to use the entire buffalo for food, for shelter, for clothing, for weapons, and because they were hunting buffalo, they didn't have to rely on crops surviving the extreme weather. Make sure you've explained, so you said because this allowed them to, or this overcame the problem of. That's the explanation part. You could have had exposure. You could have talked about the fact that for the good of the tribe was put before the good of an individual. So leaving the elderly behind allowed the rest of the tribe to move on for food. So it overcame the problem of lack of food because they're waiting for one individual or not able to move easily around. You could have talked about conflict and how they overcame the danger of being killed by other tribes because conflict was more about honour and raiding for horses and for animals than killing their enemies. So for example, they used the counting coop to gain prestige rather than killing because they needed the men for hunting. So therefore they're overcoming that problem of being killed by other tribes. Prestige was gained by the counting coop, the stick, rather than by actually killing. Or you could have mentioned that they built and used teepees and that this overcame the problem of it being difficult to move around the plains if you had to keep rebuilding your house, and that there wasn't much wood to build houses and shelters because it was easy to transport. It only took 10 minutes to pack away, and it could be made into a travois, a sledge, which made it very easy to transport. It's made out of buffalo skin in the main, although it did have some wood. The wood was transportable and it wasn't particularly anywhere near as much as if you were building a house. They also overcame the problem of extreme weather conditions because they could bank it with earth, push earth up against its sides to keep it warm in extreme cold, and in extreme heat they could hitch the sides up of the tent, of the teepee, to keep it cool inside in the summer. So any 2 or 3 of these, if it's explained, so you've said because it enabled them to overcome this problem by doing this, you get yourself the 7 marks. Okay, and finally, the Plains Indians were vicious. How far do you agree? So this was a widely held belief by many white European settlers. And you need to decide in these ways perhaps it was justified that they did seem vicious, however in these ways they weren't vicious. Overall, what do you think and why? Try to give 1 or 2, aim for 2 pieces of specific evidence to back up your points. Pause now if you want to have a go. Okay, so to agree that the Plains Indians were vicious, you could have included the idea of exposure and explained how this shows they were vicious because they were leaving the elderly behind to die so that the rest of them could live, and that this was sort of pitiless maybe. You could have mentioned the practice of scalping, that they were, if they killed an enemy, taking the scalp off a person to stop them from going to the happy hunting ground, the afterlife, and that they would display the scalps on top of their teepees to scare away their enemies. You could talk about the raiding of other tribes for horses, and also to gain prestige, to gain importance and power and status was a really common thing to do. So conflict and warfare being really common in their culture, all of these things could suggest to an extent that they were vicious. On the other hand, you could disagree. The Plains Indians were not vicious because you could say that they used the counting coop, that a fight to the death was really rare because they valued their men and those lives more than they valued killing their enemy, because the men were needed for hunting and that they could gain prestige just by tapping them with the counting coop instead. You could also argue that some aspects of their culture were misunderstood. So, for example, religious rituals like the sun dance involved pain, and they seemed to be quite vicious, hanging men up by their pectoral chest muscles in order to help them get visions. It could, to an outsider's perspective, look quite vicious, but in reality it was actually just designed to help those men get access to the spirit world and to get advice, and it was something that they would have chosen to do. They weren't being forced to do it. You then, if you wanted 8 marks, needed to write yourself a conclusion. So overall, what did you decide? That you agreed or disagreed that the Plains Indians were vicious, and a reason why you were more persuaded by one idea than the other. So, for example, I was more persuaded that, or I agree more than I disagree, because although they raided tribes quite frequently and they practiced scalping and exposure, overall the attacks were actually not designed to kill, they were just designed for prestige and to gain animals, and scalping only happened if they did, which very rarely happened, they kill their enemy. Exposure was something that the elderly also agreed to do, and it was part of their culture. And overall, it's more that they were misunderstood than that they were vicious. Or you could argue the opposite point of view as well. Okay, have a go at making some of your own exam style questions up and using your revision notes from today to help you. Good luck in your exam.